Hello and welcome to another episode of Hoshivar podcast. Consciousness is one of the deepest unresolved problems in science and philosophy. We study the brain in extraordinary detail, in neurons, circuits, and dynamics. Yet, the existence of subjective experience remains puzzling for both scientists and philosophers. How do physical processes give rise to felt experience? Why does perception feel like something from the inside? And most importantly, does consciousness actually do anything? Or is it merely a passive byproduct of neural activity? In contemporary debates, many theories treat consciousness as epiphenomenal, something that accompanies brain processes but does not causally influence them. Others go to the opposite direction, proposing that consciousness is fundamental, informational, or even ubiquitous in nature. Between these extremes lies a crucial question. Can consciousness be both scientifically grounded and causally real? My guest today, Professor Peter Ulric Tse, occupies a distinctive position in this landscape. As an experimental neuroscientist and philosopher of mind, he argues that consciousness is not merely something the brain produces, but something that actively shapes neural processing over time. Through his theory of criterial causation that you already heard in our previous talk and conversation, he challenges the idea that all causation is exhausted by macrophysical mechanisms and defends a biologically grounded account of genuine agency. Today, we will explore what consciousness is, whether it has real causal power, how it relates to free will. Of course, we talked about free will before, but I would like to ask some more questions about that, and what this means for neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and our understanding of ourselves. Professor Tse, welcome to Hoshiwara podcast again.
Hello, Mehdi. Good to talk to you.
For first questions, could you please explain to audience how you define consciousness in a way that avoids both mysticism or reductionism? I know you have a different point of view in consciousness, but as a simple term, could you please explain how you see the consciousness?
So the simplest explanation is, the simplest explanation or definition is that consciousness is that which is experienced. So experience is always from the animal's point of view. So it's a first-person subjective experience. And there's different types of experiences. Some are perceptual, some are emotional, some are the imagination. So that's the simple definition. I would argue there's more complex definitions that we can get into. For example, consciousness is a kind of informational format that allows for certain kinds of operations. So what is this format? The format is the brain's attempt to create you might call it a veridical hallucination. It's a construction of the state of the world and the body in the world, including evaluation, like desire states, emotional states that are teleological, like hunger, like fear. And this format is very special. It is the construction and the inference that is created by the brain in about 1/4 of a second to 1/3 of a second, based upon what has been detected. So first we'll talk about the perceptual case. So light hits the retina at time 0. Your conscious experience is not of what's happening on the retina. Your conscious experience is not at time 0. Your conscious experience is delayed by about, let's say, 300 milliseconds. And then you see a world. But what you see, in the case of vision, is very different from what is found on the retina. So from the retina, you have a pattern of 2D pixel-like representations. And then 1/4 to 1/3 of a second later, you experience a 3D world. Now, what is inferred? Well, first we must ask what is detected. What is detected is the light signals at different points on the retina. This is like dots, but you can connect the dots in different ways. If I have, 4 dots, boop, 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 I can connect them like this. I can connect them like this. There's many ways to connect the dots. And the connections between the dots are not in the stimulus. Connecting the dots is due to processing by, in this case, the visual system. And what is the goal of this connecting of the dots? The goal is to recover a true representation of the world as it really is. So this is analogous to the old allegory of the cave in Plato, where prisoners are inside a cave and they see 2D shadows upon the wall of the cave, and they're trying to infer the 3D structure of events outside the cave. In some ways, the inside of our eye is like the wall of the cave. There's a 2D image cast upon the back of our eyes, and from this, the brain tries to infer the structure of the world. Now, these inferential processes are remarkable. I've spent over 30 years trying to figure out what exactly these inferential processes are that happened in this roughly 300, no more than 350 milliseconds. And many of them are an attempt to recover the true nature of the world. And let me give you one example. If a bird flies behind many trees, you see a bird, then you don't see a bird. Then you see a bird, and then you don't see a bird. Now, you don't experience what you actually detect, because that's not true. The true nature of the world is that there's a bird that appears and disappears, but it continues to exist, and you experience it like that. Another example would be apparent motion. So in apparent motion, you have one light here, and then you have one light here. And what you experience is, boop, boop, you see the motion from this dot to this dot, as long as this dot appears no more than, say, 300 milliseconds after this dot. If this dot appears 20 minutes after this dot, you'll see this, and then much later, this, but you won't see motion. Now, this is remarkable because it means that there has to be a kind of pre-conscious, unconscious buffer that is comparing stimuli over space and time. It cannot be that the motion is inferred from this position, because when this light appears, a second light might never have appeared. Therefore, it must be that the inference happens after this one appears, and it goes back in time inside of a buffer, a kind of memory buffer in the visual system that says, okay, this appeared here, that appeared here earlier, it must be the same object. I will therefore infer the motion that must have happened. Now, sometimes that's wrong, and we see mistakes. I mean, in fact, this illusion is a mistake. We're seeing something that we know is wrong. In fact, we know it's this followed by this, but we see this incorrect inference. Now, this inference of the nature of the world based upon what has been detected is very elaborate. We go outside. Actually, we need to talk about two kinds of inference. One is perceptual inference, and the other is cognitive inference. So perceptual inference, or you might call it Helmholtzian inference, is the kind of inference that takes us from what is detected to what we see or hear or taste, what we perceive. And a cognitive inference is after that. Cognitive inference is based upon consciousness. So consciousness itself is the result of inferential processes that try to infer the nature of the world based upon the input. So I can go outside and I can see the ground is wet. I just see it as wet. So a mantra would be, seeing is seeing as. It is already interpreted. So I see the ground as wet and I say, oh, the ground is wet. I don't have to think, oh, it's shiny here and dark here, therefore it must be wet. No, I see it as interpreted. The concrete is wet. There's no concrete on the retina, right? So that I see concrete that happens to be covered with water is a perceptual inference. Now I can make a cognitive inference after that and say, well, it must have rained. Oh, but wait, the sky is blue. Oh, that's wrong. Maybe a gardener put water down. Oh, but that's strange because today is Sunday or Saturday when people don't work. So cognitive inferences can last, in principle for a very long time, but perceptual inferences happen in this very short duration. So what is consciousness? Consciousness is an inferred, you might call it a hallucination or a construction that has as its goal a representation of the world as it truly is and my body in it that is already pre-evaluated to some extent. Now, there are many directions to go.
Could you please explain what is the hard problem of consciousness? I know we are going back and forth between science and philosophy, like qualia, because most of the unknown is around the qualia, how these neurons make something that we sense. For example, the feeling of a garlic toasting or a bread or hugging a baby, and that feeling that comes from the neurons. I know that more relates to philosophy, that qualia, but this is the hard problem of consciousness that David Chalmers made like a few decades ago. Could you please, before I go to some of the theories that surrounds the consciousness in science, could you please explain to the audience what is the hard problem of consciousness?
Well, I mean, the simplest way to put it is, why do we experience anything at all? Why are we not simply informational input, output devices? What is the special role of this experiential format?
Yep. Yeah.
Now, people talk about different kinds of experiences like pain, like redness, right? And, so this hard problem has different aspects. One aspect is, why do different experiences have the quality that they do? Why is pain painful? If I look at the sky, why is the sky blue and not salty? And why is the ocean salty and doesn't look orange? So that's one issue. Let's just focus on the special case of vision, because that's what I happen to have been studying the most. What is detected at the retina is one wavelength at one point. But that wavelength can have multiple sources. So a single number at a single point on the retina, some percentage of it is due to shadow, some percentage is due to transparency, some percentage is due to the illuminant light, some percentage is due to the paint or the reflectance of a surface. And in fact, there are like 7 such numbers that I have to recover. How can I go from one number to 7 numbers? It's impossible unless you have prior assumptions about the image, the retinal image to world mapping. So take the case of a cat with white hair. If it runs under a blue light, it looks blue on the retina, but I want to see it actually as a white cat, a cat that happens to be under blue light. So I have to essentially dissect this single number, which is in fact a blue wavelength at the retina, and have to say, well, actually, the animal has white hair. It just happens to be under blue light. So I think, one very interesting aspect of qualia is that they represent a kind of truth. They're trying to recover an intrinsic truth about something in the world, like what is the true pigment of the cat? What is the true reflectance of paint? And we can discard or disregard the irrelevant. Like it happens to be under blue light, it happens to be, another example is as a cat runs away from you, it gets smaller and smaller on the retina. But I want to discount that retinal fact to recover a true world fact, namely that the cat is still the same size. So the world as I experience it is the result of these inferential processes that have as their goal the recovery of what is intrinsically true. So what is intrinsically true about an object? Well, it has, like a cat, it has a particular shape, it has a particular size in reality, it's made of particular materials in reality, it has an intrinsic pigment, and each of these has to be recovered. So qualia are an inference, an informational inference about the intrinsic properties of objects and events. Now, why that? Well, because we want to essentially have a correct representation of the world so we can accomplish our goals in the world, like finding food, finding shelter, finding mates. It's a little bit like having a map, right? If you want to walk around a territory, you need a good map. Consciousness is such a good map of reality that it is as if we see reality in itself. So Immanuel Kant makes the distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. And the noumenal world, we don't perceive. It is the way things are in themselves when people don't even exist. Now we detect information, we detect energy, sound energy, light energy, chemical energy. And from this, these are the dots. And then we connect the dots in these inferential processes that result in consciousness to recover what is intrinsically true about objects in the world. And then we can do things. We can make decisions like, what should I do now, given that this is my representation of the world? So consciousness is a kind of map, but it's much better than a normal map. It's three-dimensional. It's recovering true facts, ideally true facts about materials, pigments, and so forth. And it allows us to act correctly in the world. And animals that misperceive the world, for example, that interpreted holes as just shadows, might go into the hole and fall from the trees and die. So there is a tremendous selective pressure in evolution, not only to make our bodies good for surviving, but also our perception and our minds. I'll stop there.
Sure. Thank you so much. So before I go to the next question, so for the audience, I recently had a seminar in one of the Telegram group for Iranians about the landscape of consciousness, about the paper that Robert Kahn wrote last year.
Kuhn, I think it, yeah.
Yes. So about the landscape, it was published in Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology. And he describes more than 350 different theories of consciousness, ranging from materialism up to the idealism. And he explains all of this in this paper. And he published recently in October a paper in New Scientist. It's a kind of article summarizing that. So how these theories fall in the description of consciousness, as well as the free will, as well as the near-death experience and afterlife. So I have a question. So between the materialism in one spectrum, go to non-reductive physicalism, I'm reading from his website right now, to quantum and dimensions, and go toward the information, panpsychism, monoism, dualism, and idealism, where your theory of consciousness stands is in toward the materialism or non-reductive physicalism. If you explain your standing in this spectrum, so I can maybe ask more questions about that.
Okay. Well, I haven't read his whole paper because it was 100 and something pages long.
Yeah,
And
I just read the short one in the New Scientist, and I explained it. But that one is my to-do list during the holiday season, so I read it.
Well, he has essentially created a collection of every point of view. He calls it a landscape. It's not even a taxonomy, really. I guess maybe it's a taxonomy where he categorized different types of views of consciousness. He does not himself take a stance. Now, I didn't notice whether he described my theories in that paper or not, but I would say that my views...
Yeah, he mentioned you. I saw it. So it mentions your name among the others. I know where you stand, but I would like to hear where you stand in this spectrum.
Right. So I would say that I'm advocating a kind of naturalism, or an indeterministic naturalism, which is a type of physicalism or materialism, and that views all mental events as realized in the brain. So the question then is how neural events are realized in the brain. So I would not support the idea that there are mental events that continue to exist outside of brains or outside of bodies. The information has to always be physically realized. There's no free-floating information. Then I would say, a naturalistic physicalism. I reject a strict material dualism where there are souls versus matter. I don't believe in free existing souls. I would love to be proved wrong because I would like to see my father again, but I don't believe that that is how reality exists. So, for example, Robert Sapolsky and I would agree that mental events are realized in physical events. And there is lots of evidence for this. For example, just some evidence would be that the brain is highly modular, and I can knock out an area of your brain called V4, and you will lose the ability to see colors. And that's called achromatopsia. I can damage a nearby area called MT, which processes motion. And if I do that, you'll lose the ability to see motion. That's called achinotopsia, but you'll still see colors if you don't have a damaged V4. I can go to an adjacent area called lateral occipital complex and damage that, and you will lose the ability to see shapes, and you effectively become blind, even though you can see color and motion, and that's called aperceptive agnosia. So there's lots of evidence that particular types of information are realized in particular types of neurons or neuronal events. Yes, and so then I would argue that my view of consciousness is an epistemological one and not an ontological one. So that's a whole other discussion. But there are views of information, that information is realized ontologically. And, Tononi's theory of integrated information is a sort of prototypical example of an ontological theory of information that views information as, in a way, the unlikelihood of occupying a particular physical state, regardless of acts of knowing. Now, in my view, I take an epistemological view, which is to say that information is not ontological. It doesn't exist outside of acts of knowing, in particular acts of decoding. So I would say that information is created by acts of decoding, and it doesn't inhere in objects themselves. So take, for example, like you have a Persian word, bus, B-U-S. This means kiss in your language. If I have a sign bus, a Persian person would say, oh, that means kiss. But I, as a non-Persian speaker, will say that means bus. So the information is not inherent to the B-U-S ink. It doesn't inhere in the ink. The information comes into existence by how it is decoded, and different decoders will decode the same input in very different ways. So I can take any input. I can, if I use a ribosome, it might take messenger RNA and interpret, CGTAGT and use that information. It might decode that information to then create amino acids and make proteins. But a different decoder might take that same input and create information from that to go build cities or write poetry, right? So the information doesn't exist ontologically in states of the object itself, but in how it is interpreted. So I would say that my view is a physicalist one. It's not a strict identity theory, however. I'm not saying that mental events are identical to physical events. That would be a bit difficult to do because under Leibniz's principle of, what did he call it? The principle of indiscernibles. If I have two objects and they are identical, they must have the same properties. So if this one is red, this one also must be red, for example. That's obvious. But a strict physical identity theory would say, well, if neurons have mass, then the perception of redness must also have mass. But pain does not have mass. Redness does not have inertia, right? So we cannot have a strict physical identity theory. But you can have an identification between something else like active decoding. Active decoding inputs don't have mass or inertia. So information as realized in the brain might be identical with acts of decoding. Now then the question is, how do neurons decode their inputs? Anyway, so that's kind of where I am coming from in terms of his landscape. But I would go beyond that. I would say that my view is very much derived from Gestalt psychology. So the Gestalt psychologists, building on the work of Helmholtz, and before that Immanuel Kant, before that Plato, in the Allegory of the Cave, made the argument that in addition to what is detected by the sensory systems on the skin, on the retina, on the tongue, there have to be inferential processes that connect the dots. And that is not in the stimulus. That is brought to the stimulus by the brain. And therefore, consciousness is the result of highly inferential processes that are pre-conscious and unconscious. They go into the construction of consciousness with the goal of creating a world, a subjective world, so that the animal can do things. Now, what does the animal do? Typically, people think of the animal as doing things motorically, like looking for food, like looking for shelter. But really, most of the interesting mental operations precede motoric operations. So even if I, cannot move my body, let's say that I'm paralyzed, I can nonetheless carry out mental operations like paying attention to this, or paying attention to this, or paying attention to my memory, or paying attention to the radio, or paying attention to the television. And therefore, these kinds of operations operate on something. Just like a function needs an argument, like f of x equals y. An operator like volitional attention has to operate on something. What does it operate on? It operates on conscious operands. So, for example, I would define consciousness as follows. Functionally, I would define consciousness as everything that I'm experiencing now, in particular, everything that I'm volitionally paying attention to now, I'm conscious of, and anything that I'm conscious of, I could shift my volitional attention to in the next moment. So there's a deep link between three ideas. Consciousness as subjectively experienced with qualia that tell us something true about objects and events, volition, and attention. Now, like I was saying in the debate with Robert Sapolsky, consciousness is for something. It allows us to carry out these operations. Now, why are these things conscious and 99.99% of the information in the body is not conscious? Well, because that majority of information can be carried out automatically. There are no options. But for an animal, it needs to make decisions about its possibilities and take into account the entire context. And no submodule can solve these problems, right? So, even a tiger has to make basic decisions, like it's going through the Sumatran jungle and it wants to catch a tapir. Well, it can say, well, if I go this way, it's shorter but louder, and the tapir will hear me, but this way is longer and more difficult, but it's less likely that the tapir will hear me. So one role of consciousness is to carry out volitional operations that have more than one option. If there's only one option, it would be as ridiculous as to have a window pop up on your computer screen saying you have only one option, now press the button. That would be a waste of time. If there's only one option, just do it. But if there's two options and you need to think about it, have a window that says you can now either do this or you can do this. Then you have to choose this or this. So one role of consciousness is perception, but another role of consciousness is deliberation about possibilities in the internal virtual reality of our imagination. So consciousness has a kind of dual role, or you might even say a tripartite role. There's imagination, and this has a deliberate form in which we make plans, sometimes over very, very long durations. Then there's a sort of non-deliberate form of daydreaming or actually dreaming while we're sleeping. But these are both internal virtual reality. And then there's the perceptual reality of seeing a world and feeling my body in it and evaluating how things feel. Now, built into consciousness, I think, is something like attractor states. I get thirsty, so I start to look for water. I get hungry, I feel lust, I feel fear. And these teleological drives are not in the stimulus. They're entirely evaluative, and they are created by my brain in order to foster certain kinds of behaviors, like finding mates, like finding water. And animals that didn't feel thirst didn't drink, and they died. And so they didn't become our ancestors, and so forth. So there's a kind of architecture to consciousness that is much more interesting, I think, than simply, seeing redness, which is not teleological. There's also pain. I want pain to stop. There's loneliness. I want my loneliness to stop, right? So one beautiful thing about having teleological attractor states or repeller states built into consciousness as it is experienced is it allows us to not respond to the stimulus, or not only respond to the stimulus. Because, for example, if I'm hungry and I don't see food, I can say, well, where can I find food? I can think, oh, I have to go to this street over there, and there's a restaurant. Okay, is it open? Okay, then I can get up and I can go this way, or I can go this way. But it allows me to reach goals that are not in the stimulus. And that was a huge breakthrough in evolution, I think. So if an animal only responded to the stimulus, it might get lost in what is called a garden path in English, where locally this is my best option, locally this is my best option, locally this is my best option, and then I get eaten by a lion. The opposite of a garden path like that is called a desert path, where, well, locally this is terrible, locally this is terrible, locally this is terrible, but at the end of it, I get a PhD, or I get a wife, or I, can leave Iran and go to America like you did, right? So consciousness, in one way, frees us from the stimulus. It allows us to act in light of higher level goals.
So it brings me to next questions. Before I go to the next question for the audience, I will add a link to this very good website that Robert Kahn made, is Landscape of Consciousness. There is a map you can click. There is several names, papers, links to different scientific theories, as well as the non-scientific and metaphysical. This is a spectrum. So it's very well-made website. I highly recommend you, if you are interested to learn more about consciousness, regardless of where you think is the best or scientifically supported. But you can see this website if you cannot read the paper. But this is very visually very well made. So I will add a link to that. You talk about IIT, and we are translating a book by Christoph Koch, recently published last year, Then I Am Myself the Word. I'm trying to invite him as well to Hoshivar. I tried, but he said, let's wait for translation of the book passes, finishes, and then hopefully I can talk. And the IIT theory, and they have a definition of phi to measure, but it seems you are not for that theory, at least what I understood. But there are other theories in science before we go to philosophy. So global workspace theory, or the control hallucination, as Anil Seth mentions. I talked to Anil Seth as well in the Hoshivar. Hopefully I can talk to him again. So if you want to stand with one of these major theories, we have many theories. I was recently read a paper, it's more than 23 main theories in science about the consciousness, and I think Anil Seth published last year in Nature, I guess, or Nature Communication. So, but there are top theories like a global workspace, IIT, or the others. So where do you stand, or how you can define your theory of consciousness about the causal criteria, criterial causation, or other things that we discussed last few times you were my guest? Where do you stand, or where are the evidences around these theories right now? So there are people are a little confused about these theories.
Okay, well, there's so many theories, as you say, and I can try to give a very rough
Thank you so
summary of
much.
a
It's
couple,
good
a
if you
couple of
can,
them.
yeah, a couple of them, at least the main one.
Yeah. Well, okay. So there's the global workspace theory of Bernie Bars and Stan Dehaene and others. And the basic idea is that there's something like a bulletin board that unconscious modules are trying to compete to post onto. And anything that gets posted on this globe, on this workspace or this bulletin board, can be seen by all the modules. And it's a kind of metaphor. It might actually be a little bit analogous to like the screen of your laptop or something. And so what evidence is there for it? Well, certainly there are certain mental operations that seem to allow you to process things globally, like volitional attention. Whatever you're volitionally attending, whether in this module or this module, like I can pay attention to something visual, I can pay attention to something, the feeling of my feet in my shoes, I can pay attention to my memories, I can pay attention to my plans. This seems to involve mental operations that take place globally in the sense that they're not modular. But there are also modular operations that seem to be, so this goes back to the work of, what are their names? Well, the idea that he wrote a book called Mental Modularity. I'm forgetting his name right now, but he's a philosopher. And he made the argument that mental modules are very fast. They're dedicated to a certain kind of processing. They are encapsulated and they run in parallel. And those are generally regarded as not conscious. Now, I don't know if that's correct. I think probably consciousness can be realized within modules. So I probably would not agree with that view. But the global workspace idea is that these modules then compete and then they can post their information so that it is accessible by all the other modules. Now, a very different view would be the microconsciousness's view of Samir Zeki. Now, his view is that consciousness is realized in the modules themselves, and there's no need for a global broadcasting, like in global workspace theory. So Samir Zeki's idea would be that color is realized in the color processing area, motion is realized in the motion processing area, shape is realized in the shape processing area in parallel, and they each can be conscious independently. And some evidence for that would be the fact that, as I mentioned, I can knock one form of consciousness out, right? So if I knock out your color processing neurons, I mean, often when people breathe carbon monoxide, the cells that are processing color, called the color blobs in area V1, are highly sensitive to oxygen deprivation and they die first. Now, if somebody finds them again before they suffocate, they will be able to see, but sometimes they can only see in grayscale for the rest of their lives, and they have achromatopsia. So there's evidence, I think, for the idea that consciousness is realized within modules, and it doesn't require this global broadcasting. Other evidence in support of the idea that consciousness does not necessarily require a frontal lobe process is the fact that I can remove the frontal lobes, like the famous patient Phineas Gage, and people can still feel pain, see colors, and so forth. But what they lose is self-governance or executive control. And some people argue that global workspace theory is something like a frontal theory, and maybe microconsciousnesses is something like a posterior theory. I think the jury is still out. Now, then there are these other theories like IIT, that you're
IIT, yeah,
translating,
IIT.
and this is as I said, it's a view of consciousness as ontological,
Yes.
or rather, information is ontological, not epistemological. So, what does that mean? Well, just take Shannon's definition of information. It's proportional to the log of the inverse of the probability. Now, that sounds complicated, but basically, it just means that there's more information when something is surprising, it's unexpected. So you can talk about subjective probabilities, like I was expecting it to rain, but then it didn't. That was my subjective probability. So the Shannon idea is rooted in a notion of information as epistemological. It's based upon subjective probabilities. But Tononi turns us around and looks at objective probabilities. So what is an objective probability? Well, it has nothing to do with what somebody subjectively feels or thinks. Basically, if I were to run an event, like I can throw a die or a dice infinitely many times, well, maybe the probability of any given number will be given by the number of times, or the percentage of times I get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. So in principle, the objective probability of getting any number is 1 out of 6. That has nothing to do with my subjective assessment. So what Tononi is trying to do is build a story about consciousness rooted in an understanding of information as ontological. It has to do with the improbability of occupying physical states and the notion of causation from this state to this state. Now, I think this is very misguided and wrong, because going back to that example, the information in the letters B, U, S does not reside in the object. Information is not intrinsic to objects. Information arises through acts of decoding objects. And if I'm Persian, I'll say, oh, that means kiss. If I'm English, I'll say, oh, that means bus. And since he does not build in acts of decoding into his story, but acts of decoding are centrally what neurons do. That is what neurons are doing. They're looking for patterns of input that will allow them to say, that which I'm sensitive to, or that which I'm tuned to, is in the input. And so, for example, Itzhak Fried and Christoph Koch and another scientist called Quiroga have discovered very interesting neurons in the hippocampus called concept neurons. And these neurons are just incredible. Like, you can take some famous person like Oprah Winfrey, and these neurons will fire if you show them a picture of Oprah Winfrey, or they'll fire the same way if you play her voice, or they'll fire in the same way if you write her name. So those neurons, they call them concept neurons, have very high level criteria, and they seem to be responding to Oprah Winfrey, regardless of the modality. But if you go to input areas like auditory input cortex, that neuron will respond to the tone 1000 hertz. If you go to V1, it'll respond to a bar, maybe, of this orientation. So it's very low level criteria. But you can imagine that you can build neurons with successively more complicated criteria. So at V1, it's sensitive to a bar or a moving bar. But maybe at V2, it's sensitive to a corner or a moving corner. Maybe at LOC, it's responding to complex shapes. In the fusiform face area, it's responding to faces. Other areas are responding to hands. So you can imagine you can create higher and higher level criteria. So for example, if I want to create a corner detector, I can say, well, I have this neuron responding to this. In V1, I have this other neuron responding to this. Now I have another neuron that says, if this fires and this fires, I will fire. So now this neuron responds to this. And then maybe another neuron will respond to this. And you can see how you can create a hierarchy of ever more complex criterial detectors. Now, one of my central arguments is that neurons don't only make each other fire, neurons also change each other's criteria for future firing. And this allows neurons, one neuron might respond to cats normally, but, in the next moment, it might respond to dogs. Going back to these concept neurons in the hippocampus, if they show a movie to a patient, a particular neuron in the hippocampus might fire to one person. But if they show a different movie, that same neuron will now fire to a different person, right? So the criteria can change. Now, how do criteria change? Well, this is a very complicated story, but I think that it has to do with changing synaptic weights. So I've given the metaphor of an interaction between energy passing through the system. This is like action potentials, and the filtering of those action potentials, and that is synaptic weights. And I gave the analogy, I think, in one of my conversations with you of the vibration of the voice. And if I measured only this, I would get, in addition, I need to change my filters. But if I tried to measure my filters, there's no sound coming from my mouth. This is silent. This is like synaptic weights, but you need both. And a very important part of the neural code is this capacity of neurons to change each other's synaptic weights so that they are changing their criteria for firing. And we do this all the time for ourselves when we're trying to solve problems during deliberation, right? I can give you some problem like, I can give you a problem that has only one solution. That's not so interesting. Like, what's your mother's maiden name? That's one solution. But I can give you a very loose solution, like, think of a dog. Well, you've thought of many dogs and you know many dogs. Why did you think of that one? Well, it met your criteria. I can say, think of a capital of a country. And you might say, I don't know, Ulaanbaatar, or you might say, whatever, Istanbul. Why did you say that? Well, maybe it was somewhat random, but it was random, it was not utterly random. It had to meet those criteria that you yourself set. And if I were to rewind the universe, maybe you would have said something different. So there's a degree of randomness that is highly constrained by the criteria that you yourself set, or that I set when I gave you those criteria. And what's very interesting to me is how this is realized neuronally. One mechanism is simply by paying attention. So when you pay attention to this location versus that location, there's actually a brain area called the nucleus basalis of Maynard that goes all the way back, and it literally injects or releases acetylcholine into the synapses corresponding to that location in area V4, and that transforms those neurons and their behavior. And what do I think is going on when you pay attention to something? By changing those synaptic weights, because of the release of acetylcholine, you actually change the behavior of the neuron. And what that affords is the ability to to bind information from across different modules. So everybody has probably seen this very famous example of the gorilla. I don't know if you've seen it, but the task is to see the gorilla. Maybe you can show this to your audience. I don't know if people have seen this, but when they show this movie to people, typically, or at least over more than half the time, people do not see the gorilla because their task is to pay attention to the white team passing the ball. So if you're paying attention to the white team, you're ignoring the black team. And then a black gorilla comes out and stands right where people are looking and does this, and more than half the people don't notice. Does that mean that they were not conscious of the gorilla? No, I would say they probably saw black moving stuff in the background. But if you pay attention to that location of the gorilla, this binds the features of motion and blackness into a gorilla. So this is one example of a volitional transformation of the contents of consciousness. What is not attended is something like qualia soup. But when you attend to a location, poof, it turns into a gorilla. Okay, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have a few more questions. So one of them, you know, of course, better than me. So Daniel Dennett, the late Daniel Dennett, wrote Consciousness Explained. So he supports the epiphenomenal way of consciousness. So uh, some scientists or neuroscientists, they treat consciousness like this. So they are saying it's a kind of illusion. What do you think this view is wrong or true, or how you stand with it? And about the causality. So I think, as I understood from our discussions, you are a non-reductive physicalism scientist. You don't reduce everything to the material, like for example, the neurons or the genes or such that. So we talk about emergence or other things. So how do you see yourself about the late Daniel Dennett view that some scientists they say, okay, consciousness is illusion that comes out of the neurons and doesn't have any causal effect down, similar to emergent or higher order causality that we discussed, and you discussed with Robert Sapolsky as well. So how you stand with this type of theories that some scientists support?
So probably the most radical epiphenomenalists are the people who argue that qualia and subjective experience in general doesn't even exist. I think Patricia and Paul Churchland are probably like this. Dennett is probably less extreme. He would argue not. He would argue that. Well, I mean, some people called his book not Consciousness Explained, but Consciousness Explained Away, because he's arguing that consciousness is not causal; it's epiphenomenal. So, what does epiphenomenal mean? It means that it 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 maybe co-occurs but doesn't cause anything. So, if I move my hands like this hand can make this hand move. But if I look at the shadows, a shadow cannot make a shadow move. A shadow has no causal efficacy. Probably in philosophy, the person who best embodies the idea of epiphenomenalism would be Jaegwon Kim, who argued that mental events supervene upon or are realized in physical events, but all of the causal efficacy is only physical on physical. So if mental event one is realized in physical event one, and mental event two is realized in physical event two, physical event one causes physical event two, but mental event one cannot cause mental event two. Okay, so I think they're wrong. I think mental events are causal. Now, I can give a very simple sort of almost idiotic task. I could say, describe to me what you're experiencing. And you might say, well, my back hurts and I'm hungry and maybe, I feel a little bit itchy here, So you can describe your experience. That is to say, you can describe the contents of your consciousness. So it's very difficult to think of a causal mechanism that doesn't involve consciousness. Like it seems like consciousness must be causal because you're describing your consciousness, and certainly it's effective it has effects in the universe. Like you're moving your jaw this way, so atoms of calcium in your jaw are moving differently than if you had described different contents of consciousness. Now, there's an argument in philosophy called the exclusion argument by Jaegwon Kim. And the basic idea is that all causation seeps down to the bottommost layer. So, for example, you might think that you go to the dentist because you have a toothache and you feel pain. But in fact, all causation is only quarks on quarks or atoms on atoms. And the pain is not the real reason that you went to the dentist. The real reason is that these atoms hit these atoms in just a certain way so that you went to the dentist. I think that's completely absurd. And yet you have to have an argument against the exclusion argument. So the essence of the exclusion argument is that under determinism, physical event one is sufficient to account for physical event two. The way to get out of the exclusion argument is to point out that under indeterminism, physical event one is not sufficient to cause physical event 2 because a different event might have happened because it was not determined. So, for example, in the famous two-slit experiment of quantum theory, you can send a photon through two slits, and it might end up here, or it might end up here, or it might end up here, or it might end up here, and that you get a kind of probability distribution. So what quantum theory describes is highly deterministic, but it is not deterministic at the level of individual events. It is deterministic at the level of infinitely many events or stochastic events, right? So what the Schrödinger equation describes is the evolution of a probability density function, but at the level of an individual event, it is indeterministic. Okay, so if it is true that the rootmost level is indeterministic, then this physical event is not sufficient to account for what happens next. Many other things could happen. So what I argue with criterial causation is that criteria can be placed upon inputs that will allow a neuron to fire, and the neuron will only fire if those informational criteria are met. Now, there are many physical paths at the level of quarks or atoms that are possible because of ontological microscopic indeterminism. However, by placing these top-down constraints, only a small subset of those physically possible outcomes can happen, which are also meeting those informational constraints. So it's not that neurons cause events that are not physically possible. They just sculpt out of all the events that are physically possible at the level of quarks, that subset, which is also an informational causal path. So what criterial causation allows is for information to be downwardly causal. It essentially sculpts out of all possibilities that are possible at the physical level, that subset, which is also informational, an informational causal sequence.
Thank you so much. So before I ask the last two questions, one about the artificial intelligence and one about the animals, including Octopus, I would like to ask you about the panpsychism. In the spectrum of consciousness, the landscape that Robert Kahn mentioned, one side is materialism, the other side is idealism. But after the information theory, like IIT, and before that quantum theory, so it's the panpsychism. I know some scientists, even in Iran, they follow and pay attention to this, and this is a place that sometimes go to pseudoscience or some misinterpretation of the scientific theory about panpsychism. Could you please, in your way, elaborate a little bit what panpsychism means, or what the scientists that support panpsychism? I don't know many scientists supporting panpsychism, but at least some scientists they do, and some philosophers. So we don't go to metaphysical side, which is dualism or idealism or even monoism, but at least the information or panpsychism, they are sitting in between the physical or metaphysical kind of theories. So could you please, at least to talk about information, but please also elaborate a little bit about panpsychism and what does it mean and what science is saying about panpsychism?
Okay. Well, first, let's talk about physical monism. And as you mentioned, there are different types. One is that the fundamental substance is something like energy changing in time and space. I would advocate that view, that the fundamental material is probably something like what they call action in quantum physics, with the units of energy time. Other people, like Berkeley, argued that the fundamental substance is something like mind or spirit or soul. If you have that form of idealism, that's one form of panpsychism, I suppose. But the kind of panpsychism I think you're talking about is the kind that's advocated by Tononi. And that idea is that information is ontological. It is not epistemological. Now, I view information as realized epistemologically in acts of decoding, like reading, um, by interpreting inputs, which is what I think neurons do. Tononi's view is that everything has some degree of integrated information. And by integrated information, he means very specifically sort of the causal power of this state and its, its probability of causing this next state in the future or this past state. And he can create what's called a, what did he call it? A transformational probability matrix. And that he equates information or even qualia with this kind of description of the causal power, which has nothing to do with acts of decoding, say, the outside world. There's nothing about perception. It's entirely intrinsic to the system. And I think this is, well, I think it's misguided because I think that information is fundamentally about decoding, especially the outside world, as in perception. But, under that view, everything has some kind of causal structure. And therefore, everything has a phi value, and everything must be conscious to some degree. So this leads to seemingly very paradoxical situations, like take, a city like Tehran. Is Tehran conscious? Or is a beehive conscious? Well, I think it has a phi value because there's, systems of causal interaction, and we can describe them with a probability matrix. But I think that this view leads to kind of absurd questions like, is that neighborhood in Tehran also conscious? What is the relationship? How do you go from individual buildings, the consciousness of individual buildings, to the consciousness of a city block, to the consciousness of all of Tehran or the whole world? So there's, the seeming absurdities. But I think for me, basically, if there are no acts of decoding, interpretation of inputs, evaluation of inputs, that then become informative for a decoder or reader, there's no information. Information is created by those acts of decoding. So anything that has no acts of decoding, like a rock, like a city, like a beehive, is not conscious. So the vast majority of nature is not conscious because there are no acts of decoding. The interesting question I think, is, how do neurons actually decode? And I think then we can ask questions about the neural code and how neurons actually do decode their inputs. And I think that's a whole separate discussion that's very interesting. So I don't find integrated information theory interesting. I think it's wrong. And I think panpsychism is wrong. And it seems almost like common sense that tables don't have consciousness. They don't have subjective experience, right? So I don't know what to say to people who actually believe this. I mean, it seems to me a little bit like some kinds of stances that are perhaps not disprovable, but they're probably wrong, like solipsism, right? You might say, the entire universe exists only in my mind, and I exist only in the consciousness of Mehdi Shafa, but I don't actually exist. I can't disprove that, right? So I think, it's a big mistake, and we should just forget this kind of ontological notion of information, because that's not actually what information is. It's not about objective probabilities. It's about subjective probabilities. And it evolved for something. It evolved for the goal of acting in a world, right?
Yes.
So perception is very fundamental to consciousness. Mental operations over what you perceive are very fundamental. Teleological states, like desires and emotions, are very fundamental to experience so that you can do what you need to do and find water if you're thirsty. Yeah, so I think panpsychism is it's a fashion, but it will pass.
Thank you so much. So as I understood from your arguments and read some of your books and papers, it seems you are more toward what maybe Anil Seth is also mentioning, that this consciousness comes out of some biological substances. Anil said mentions that similar to you, the consciousness may not come from non-live subjects because they don't have this subjective experience, even though different orders or different levels. So please correct me if I'm wrong. So I think you are sitting more toward what Anil said, mentioning in his book and also about the papers, but please correct me. So, but what do you think if consciousness is only relates to biological substances, if you agree? So what is your standing with artificial intelligence? So, or what the artificial intelligence is moving toward consciousness or not? Because some scientists or philosophers, they are saying might be based on the information IIT or maybe panpsychism, the AI may get conscious. They can feel, or because of the feed, the number that they measure, or they're saying if this goes beyond certain criteria, they may feel conscious. What do you think about the future of current or future of AI? Can AI reach to a consciousness in at any time, or consciousness only get limited by life? So only something should be alive to have consciousness. And then I have the last questions about animals.
Well, we are physical systems made of matter, and we know that we're conscious. And I infer that you're also conscious because you have a similar brain and body to mine, and you speak as if you're conscious. And so that seems very reasonable to me, that all people are conscious. Now with AI, they're realized not in our kind of matter, but silicon, basically. Could they become conscious? I don't see why other physical systems cannot be conscious. I think that in principle, they could be conscious, but that doesn't mean that they're currently conscious, right? I mean, just we might be able to realize for example, the inferential processes that go into our construction of the world, our subjective experience of a world. I think perhaps AI systems could be built in that way. I don't think they are now. We could perhaps, add mental operations like attention that can evaluate and deliberate on the basis of needs and teleological states like thirst and hunger. But I don't think those systems, no AI system now has a teleological structure to it. I mean, it's not added into the format of the experience. But I don't think it's in principle impossible. But I do note that computers, as they currently exist, are very, very different than how brains exist. I mean, if we talk about the old style computers, not neural nets, but the von Neumann architecture, there's a hardware-software distinction, but there's no hardware-software distinction in my brain. There's probably no consciousness in such a system. And no computer is rewiring itself on a millisecond timescale like our brain is doing with, for example, paying attention to this versus that. Also, the fundamental unit, even if we look at the neural net structure of, I'm old enough now to have seen different waves of this. I remember in the 80s, it was, before I was born, there was McCulloch and Pitts, and then it kind of went, and then it went down. And then when I was young, it was Rumelhart and McClelland, I think, and parallel distributed processing, and then it kind of went down. But then with Jan LeCun and others, and Jeff Hinton and Peter Dayan especially in the 2000s, it really took off again because they started invoking sort of versions of supervised learning like back propagation. But even with their systems, the neuron, it's not really a neuron, is a point, it's a value, it's a single value, right? This is extremely different than what a neuron does. A neuron takes not just, a neuron takes lots of inputs across its dendritic arborizations, and it sends lots of outputs. And it's evaluating those inputs for moment by moment patterns of inputs. And that is not how current neuronal net architectures work. But maybe people can invent something that's more neuronal. And I wouldn't be so arrogant as to say that consciousnness can only be realized in our kinds of brains, because I think it's realized in other kinds of brains, like octopuses. So if you want to talk about animals.
Yes, I will talk. Before I go to the last topic that I would like to cover, maybe you notice I have some cold. I'm so sorry. So I didn't want to miss this opportunity to talk to Peter. He may be traveling next year or what, so I didn't want. But I'm okay. Just it has like a mild cold. Sorry about that. Before I go to next question, so about the panpsychism, I will. You know that it was last year or the year before, many scientists wrote a paper to Nature or Science about the IIT, the theory of IIT, and also panpsychism, and they said it's kind of pseudoscience. I think Anil said wrote a paper to the same journal, I guess, replied that there is some evidence or experimental evidence behind it. Anyway, so the discussion is going on. I will include both of them in the description of this video for the people who want to, because Anil Seta was also a guest for this podcast. So I'm thinking maybe I invite him next year again to talk. Other thing also for the audience, Iranian audience, me and one of my colleagues, we want to go to this website of Landscape of the Consciousness and go one by one, maybe a few sessions, and we go to explain more detail about each of these theories or subcategories. I think it's good for everybody to know, and we stay in the neutral position for now, just explain to the people what are the spectrum of consciousness, how and why it was very important during the history that many people pay attention to the consciousness. It still is a hot debate, and still we don't know everything about consciousness. So for the
I was one of the
oh,
124
you
authors
were
of that.
oh,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
were sorry, I because at that time I knew you, but I didn't talk to you at that time. Maybe I go back to that paper and read it.
Yeah,
But
it
anyway,
came
there
out in
was a
Nature Neuroscience.
yeah,
Well,
neuroscience.
I then wrote another article, which I will send you, and you can post it,
Please, please,
that
please.
explained my particular view about why ontological views of information are misguided.
Sure,
But
I will.
let me just add to that thought, because the original person to argue that information is ontological rather than epistemological, realized in acts of decoding, was a guy named Landauer, who made the argument that any step in an information processing system has to involve the creation of heat. Because information is realized physically, any transformation of information has to involve a physical transformation, and that will generate heat. And so I think that he was the beginning. He wrote a paper called Information is Physical. And I think this was a terrible title because it was very misleading. What he should have said is that informational carrying capacity is physical. So what do I mean? So for example, if I have a CD or a DVD, like a little disc, it can carry whatever, let's say, 1 terabyte of information. So its carrying capacity is 1 terabyte, and that is realized physically. But we have to make a distinction between the carrying capacity of a DVD and the particular information that is carried on a DVD in zeros and ones. So let's say it's, when it's a blank DVD, it has the potential to carry 1 terabyte. Then I put, 5 Mozart symphonies on the DVD. Now it has a particular set of zeros and ones. And we should not confuse informational carrying capacity with the particular information that is carried. And moreover, we should not confuse that with how that is decoded by a decoder. So there's 3 things that are getting confused. One is the potential to carry information. Then there's the particular zeros and ones that are realized. And then there's the decoder who interprets that. So if I put a DVD into this DVD player, it might play Mozart. But if I put it into a different system, it might go build buildings, right? So there's a big confusion about the potential information that can be carried the actual information is being carried, and then how that information is decoded. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for clarification. Um, so yeah, please send me that paper that you mentioned. I will include in the description so the audience they can read. For the last question, I know you have worked with some animals, like some conscious animal, like octopus, and there are kind of agreement between among scientists that maybe many animals are conscious, maybe not self-conscious, but they are conscious, and they understand based on the definition that even you mentioned about consciousness, they are conscious because it brings the consequence of this is the morality, the moral responsibility we have about animals. I have recently translated a book by Professor Peter Singer, The Animal Liberation Now. He was my guest as well. So he discussed in that book that there are some evidence that animals consciously understand the environment and reacts. That not only a simple reaction like bacteria, they interpret and then they are conscious, or some animals like crows or elephant or even octopus, they are self-conscious. I know the mirror test is the old way of testing, but if you can explain that. But first of all, I have two questions. What about experience with working with octopus first? Why you are working with octopus? Why is important? We know that octopus and humans consciousness, they may be divided in evolution and they went different ways. It seems they evolved separately from each other, at least to my knowledge. But also the next one, how do you see the consciousness or self-consciousness among animals, including octopus? And because you are philosophers, and how you interpret this for the actual animal world or ethics that we have toward animals.
Well, there's a lot there.
I know, but
So
I mean, yeah, this is important. It's a hot topic as well. I would like if you can explain. Yes, thank you.
yeah, so in 2017, I started an octopus lab, and I have had it until now. I recently closed it because I'm going to Cambridge University next year for 1 year, but I'll probably open it again when I return. So why open an octopus lab? Well, evolution has created complex nervous systems really only 3 times in 3 lineages. The arthropods, like insects, praying mantises, honeybees, the mollusks, like octopuses, and then the chordates, like humans, reptiles, birds. Everything else has very simple nervous systems, like jellyfish, hydra. So if you want to understand how something works, you should look at what evolution created, right? So if I want to understand how to fly, I can look at all the animals that have evolved flying. So in the chordates, you have pterodactyls, you have birds, and you have bats. And bats did this, and birds did this, and pterodactyls had giant pinkies, bizarrely. But they had certain things in common, like they flapped and they had membranes, and the wings typically have a certain shape that causes lift. So if you want to understand flying, you should look at the solutions that evolution discovered just by exploring the space. If you want to understand the mind, you should look at complex minds that evolved more or less independently. So the most different complex brain in the world, I think, is the octopus. Now, humans have something like 86 billion neurons, but about 72 billion neurons are in the cerebellum. So what we call our brain, free of the cerebellum, is actually only, certainly about the cortex, might be about 16 billion neurons. Octopuses have about 500 million neurons. About 40% of those are between the 2 eyes, so it's in the optical lobes and vertical lobes, and about 50-60% are in the arms, making autonomous decisions. So, your nervous system has a kind of a centralized organization, maybe like the government of Iran or the United States, with a strong central government. But octopuses have a kind of organization that's more like Switzerland, where each individual arm can make its own decisions. Now, if you look at the neurons of octopuses, they're quite different, and yet they seem to be carrying out similar operations. And octopuses face very similar problems to, say, a cat. They occupy a similar niche as a cat. So cats and dogs are very different. So dogs are pack hunters and they chase an animal until it becomes exhausted and then they kill it. Cats are ambush hunters. They wait and then, right? So a leopard will sit in a tree and wait till an antelope comes and then they fall. Octopuses are like that. And they are very cunning. So they hide and then what they want to eat is crabs, right? Not antelopes, and they grab it. So now the question is, what is an octopus actually representing, right? Can an octopus represent the invisible, for example? Like we represent the invisible. I can represent many things. In fact, I now believe, that much of what we call seeing or vision is actually a representation of the invisible. Like causation is not visible, but I see things as causal, right? If I go like this and the light turns off, I think that I made it turn off, even if I didn't. I can't see your mind, but I can decode your intentions to some extent by looking at your eyes. I can't see the back of you, but I assume that you are continuous and, not just floating, and I assume that this is connected to this. Do octopuses carry out similar operations? So we find that the answer is yes. Octopuses are also constructing quite complex representations of the world. So, for example, we did one experiment that asked whether they can use a mirror. Right? So when you drive a car, you look at a mirror and you can see a car here, but the car is actually over there. But you didn't actually, you weren't born with that knowledge. You had to learn that. And so we did exactly this experiment with octopuses where we put a mirror. So the octopus is here, we have a wall here, and then there's a mirror over here. And then behind the wall, we put an image of a crab, with a projector, so not a real crab. And then they can see the crab in the mirror and they go straight to the mirror. But quickly, they learn that there's no crab there. The crab is here. And what is exciting is that they start to take shortcuts. They see the crab there and they go over the divider and come down because that's the shortest path. So this kind of evidence suggests that they have a complex representation of the world in 3D that allows them to act in the world in an optimal way. And they certainly act as if they feel pain. For example, one time I had an octopus put its arm into the fan. We have water fans and it got cut off. And it spent, weeks holding the hand and rubbing the hand. So, can I prove that an octopus has subjective experience? No, but I can't prove that you have subjective experience either, right? I take your word for it. But I know that there are certain operations that you can only do over conscious operands. So, for example, one is attentional tracking. So attentional tracking is, if you look at my nose and there are many birds flying around, I say, pay attention to this one. You can put your attention on that one and it flies around. And then after 1 minute, I'll say, which one was it? And you'll say, oh, it was that one. So you're able to put an attention on some subset of your subjectively experienced consciousness. Now, can an octopus do attentional tracking? So we did one very simple experiment where we had a virtual rock, and then a virtual crab goes, right? So you're an octopus, and now the rocks look identical. But now if this rock goes from here to here, or here to here, or crosses, does the octopus still go to the one that presumably still has the crab behind it? And if they're hungry, they do. So they're representing, at least in some kind of working memory, where the crab must be. But again, I could probably write a computer script that would do that. And I don't believe that computer scripts are conscious, right? So it's very hard to prove that an animal is conscious, but I think that it makes sense that an animal will represent its world so that it can act in the world, and that evolution has worked very hard to create a good map of the world so that we can act in the world appropriately. The other idea is that, we descend from a common ancestor with an octopus or a honeybee, and that animal was called Ur bilateria, and it might have existed in the Probably, I think, in the Precambrian, let's say 580 million years ago to 650 million years ago. And then it diverged, but that little animal was probably a few millimeters long. It was probably a sea worm, but it probably had some degree of light sensitivity. It itself might have been conscious. I mean, there's no way to, consciousness does not leave fossils. So it's probably unanswerable. But my guess is that most of the animals that carry out complex operations like attentional tracking are probably conscious. And it makes sense also to have conscious experiences like pain, because you need error signals. I mean, I think another important point about causation in the brain is not just criterial causation, but cybernetic causation. So under cybernetic causation, I mean, that's the old-fashioned word, but we'll just call it that. You have a goal, and then you try to reach your goal, but you have error signals saying you're leaving your goal, right? So like if you have an airplane and a missile goes to the location of the airplane, but now the airplane has moved. And so now there's an error. So it goes this way, but now the airplane has moved. And so there's constant error correction. Now, the beauty of consciousness is that it allows us to fulfill these long-term goals. Like I'm hungry and I want to go to the restaurant. And as I go to the restaurant, I trip or somebody pushes me but I get up and I correct myself, and then I continue on my goal. I'm able to correct errors. Animals are also able to correct errors in this sense and seem to be goal-directed. Like octopuses are very goal-directed. They're trying to find prey, and sometimes they'll go look for prey, right? So I think one important idea is that consciousness is not simply the result of the input. Rather, the input is the result of an act of consciousness. So it's the flip. Right? So I can move my eyes, I can move my body to get the input that I want. Namely, I want to see a restaurant or I want to see a crab. And this goal-directedness, both subserved by teleological states like desires, like hunger, and higher level goals like I want to find a restaurant, which might be thought of as a cognitive goal, they're both goal-oriented and they centrally involve consciousness, and consciousness allows us to then carry out what we need to carry out, right? So if consciousness is the format for carrying out volitional operations, like paying attention to this versus that, or deliberation in the internal virtual reality of consciousness that allows me to make a plan to go to this restaurant versus that restaurant, it is causal in the universe. It is, without consciousness, you cannot carry out these volitional operations. That is to say, the conscious format, you might say qualia, these operands are necessary to carry out the volitional operations that require this conscious format that allow us to fulfill our goals, like finding a restaurant or catching a crab.
Thank you so much. For the audience, for Iranian audience, the book of Animal Liberation may be published hopefully by the New Year, Iranian New Year, which is in March. So I will be happy to host Professor Singer again. We can talk about the animals from the philosophical point of view, not the scientific point of view. He's very well known, for at least for the audience, they don't know him. Interesting about the octopus, Peter. So you mentioned that we separated around 500 million years ago, or 600 million years ago, or around that time. But interesting, also the eyes also evolved separately. So our eye, like retina is different than their retina. They don't have, I think, blind spot, correct? So they don't have blind spot, and the photoreceptors are toward the light. And it's like in human is backward. So it's not very good engineering in human eyes. Maybe octopus eye is much better engineered, at least evolved during evolution. That's the argument that like people who are against the intelligent design, they argue that, okay, so you look at the octopus eye, which is different than human eyes, which is not very perfect. So we lose the blind spot, which brains, I guess, put together the image on that spot and make a word like uniform.
But I mean, that is true, right? Convergent evolution, very beautifully constructed through trial and error, two eyes that at the gross level are almost identical. There's a cornea, there's an iris, there's a lens, and then there's a retina. But as you said, their retina is in a way more correct, right? The photoreceptors are inside and the neurons are outside, whereas in us, the neurons are inside, blocking the light, and the photoreceptors are behind. And then the axons have to get out of the eye in us, creating a blind spot. But I do think there's a very fundamental difference between our consciousness and the consciousness of an octopus, because an octopus probably only has a first order consciousness rooted in perception, and maybe it's bodily states. We have that also, but in addition, we have, like icing on a cake, this level of representations of invisible forces, ideas, narratives, right? So humans are very different even from a chimpanzee, because chimpanzees seem to be fundamentally rooted in the here and now, what they're experiencing with their bodies in this world now. We have that, but in addition, we're creating stories. And so this makes us go crazy, right? So we'll say, well, it hasn't rained in, 3 months, therefore the gods must be angry, these invisible gods behind the clouds, and therefore we should throw a baby into the volcano, right? And no chimpanzee does crazy stuff like that. So our ability to create narratives or stories is kind of like our superpower. It allows us to see patterns in the invisible that are actually there, but it also makes us false alarm and see patterns that are not there, right? So maybe there's no gods that are actually angry at us, but we create this story. So I think a lot of religion arises from this attempt to explain causation behind the apparent.
Yes.
But it gave us a huge advantage. This kind of transformation of consciousness from just first order to first order and second order gave us the ability to see patterns that were true also. So, for example, if a lion sees a bunch of hoof prints in the sand in the Serengeti, it will do nothing. But a human, 2 million years ago would say, "Aha! There were zebras and they were going in this direction, and they were about 7 of them, and they were going probably behind that mountain." And so we could see the invisible in a way and decode reality, and we could go there and the lion wouldn't go there, and we can kill the zebras, and that would help us survive more than lions. But it also is our greatest weapon, and also because we have this incredible imagination, it allows us to imagine amazing things, like we're going to put a person on the moon, and like Kennedy in 1961 said, we're going to put a person on the moon, and they did it in 8 years. It's incredible. But Hitler had a different imagination, and he imagined the Holocaust, and he killed, many people, 60 million people, I think, counting the war. And also our imaginations also can make us miserable, right? I mean, I've heard people say, my life has been an endless string of catastrophes, most of which never happened, right? So we're completely consumed with imaginary dangers, which makes us miserable. So humans are complex. I think our consciousness is different from that of a chimpanzee or an octopus because we're not solely perceptual or bodily. We're also in this domain of imagination. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. As a closing question or looking forward to the future, I was listening to one of the podcasts that Christoph Koch was talking. So he was mentioning that maybe as human, we may not be able to solve the hard problem of consciousness, the qualia. Maybe we have to find different physical laws or something like that. So how do you think about the future if that qualia, not other aspects of consciousness? We know a lot about consciousness, where it forms or how the neurons are working. And if we lose part of the brain, maybe we lose consciousness, or part of it, maybe cerebellum is not very important in consciousness. But as a qualia, that hard problem, do we need a new kind of physical law to explain that, how these physical interaction and neural interaction cause that sensation in humans? Subjective, I'm talking about that subjective. or no, maybe in the future we may able to find how it comes to our consciousness, how that sensation, or it might be even out of the scope of the science for now to solve that hard problem of consciousness that David Chalmers mentioned a few decades ago.
So most sciences, in fact, all sciences except for neuroscience and psychology, are concerned with publicly observable events. So in chemistry, you measure chemicals, and in physics, you measure stars, etc. And you can observe them with instruments, telescopes, microscopes, etc. Neuroscience and psychology are different in that they can measure publicly observable things like neural activity, like blood flow in functional magnetic resonance imaging, like electrical signals like EEG. We can also measure publicly observable behavior. But in addition to the brain and behavior, we have a third source of information, which is our subjective experience. And this is not publicly observable. So this is this is unlike any other science. And yet, everybody, I think, assumes that subjective experience is not this random thing. It exists for a reason so that we can carry out our goals, that we can represent the nature of the world. And, I believe it's realized in neural activity. I don't think the present laws of physics can account for it, but I don't think that that means that it's a non-physical, it's realized non-physically. So the present laws of physics emphasize amplitude of energy and frequency of energy, but what underlies criterial causation and information processing in the brain is an emphasis of phase of energy. So what is phase? Phase is about relationships. So like I can have one event like this, and I could have another event like this, and those events can be they are in phase or out of phase. They can be 90 degrees out of phase, and that phase relationship doesn't exist in any particular atom. It exists in the relationship among component parts. And this is why, I think that relationships are so fundamental. Now, when you talk about the mass of an object or the inertia of an object, you can often model an object simply as a point, like a planet as a point. But what neurons are responding to is patterns of input. And it's the sensitivity to patterns, I think, is what led to the emergence of life. So very simple physical systems that became sensitive to the phase of energy and not just the amount of energy or the frequency of energy, or for example, receptors. I can have one of the most important receptors in the brain is called the NMDA receptor, and it opens up and it lets calcium flow in, but only if three things are true. Glutamate has to be binding to so the shape of the molecule has to fit into this sort of lock and key. In addition, the postsynaptic neuron must already be depolarized because preceding so-called AMPA receptors have already opened. And there's a kind of circuit breaker coming from astrocytes or glial cells called D-serine or glycine that allows the glial cells to turn off this possibility of neural firing. So even at the level of a receptor, there's a sensitivity to the shape of the inputs. That's a kind of spatial phase. But neurons are at a much higher level. They're sensitive to the timing of inputs. So, I might have an axonal branch that has this branch, and a dendritic branch that has this branch and this branch. And this will, if there's an input, this might depolarize. And if there's input here, this might depolarize, but this will only depolarize when both this and this are activated at the same time. So dendritic computation, I think, is very fundamental to the neural code, which is completely missing from AI. And you can carry out Boolean operations like and, or, XOR in the dendrites in order to evaluate the inputs. So you're looking at patterns of input to make decisions like, is Oprah in the world? Is Oprah Winfrey in the world? Is there a cat in the world? So I do think that physics as presently described, which physics, doesn't emphasize phase relationships nearly as much as biology does. Biology took the sensitivity to pattern, spatial pattern, temporal pattern, and built whole new systems that were evaluating their inputs on the basis of informational criteria. And that's radically different from physical causation that is not biological. So, for example, I might have a rock in a waterfall and the water is falling. The rock is not saying, okay, if the pattern is dun, 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 I'll do something. Or if it's some other, rocks don't evaluate their inputs, right? And so this evaluation of inputs, looking at phase relationships, whether shape or timing, led to an explosion of new kinds of causation, which I call criterial causation, but I could also call it pattern causation or phase causation. And this new kind of physical system brought into the universe a new kind of causation. Now, it's not supernatural, but it was something additional that, stars don't do and atoms alone don't do. You have to build physical systems that are looking for patterns. And neurons are one extreme example of that then do something. So it's a little bit like a mouse trap. Like, a mouse trap, you set the mouse trap and there's a little piece of cheese here. And then if something comes along, boom, right? So the mouse trap, it's not saying, is it a mouse or is it not a mouse? But it has some sort of simple criteria, like it has to press this little bar and have a certain weight. But neurons are like little mouse traps, but they're not evaluating the weight of their input. They're evaluating the timing and pattern of their inputs in service of a goal, which is saying, is the information that I'm looking for present in my inputs?
Thank you so much, Peter. I never get tired talking to you or listening to you. I think my audience also already appreciated this and welcome even more maybe sessions with you in the future. Hopefully in the next year I can reach to you to discuss other scientific topics in your area of interest.
Well, I would love to go to Iran. I have never been to Iran.
So maybe we go together, maybe one time. Maybe
I would like
I'm hoping that maybe, the situation in Iran is not very optimal. So we hope that
it's not optimal in the United States either.
Either.
I think science and philosophy are human beings at their best. We don't care about how people look.
We don't care.
We don't care what country they come from. We care about the ideas and the truth. And I think politics and geopolitics and war is the worst aspect of humans.
Exactly.
And,
hopefully the politicians can talk to each other similar to scientists. They work to each other and talk to each other, and they can solve the issues through negotiations and peaceful way. So hopefully it happens. I hope that no war happens against Iran again. That the situation is not very good. But anyway, we can go together. Maybe I show you Isfahan or other cities.
I would love to go. I would go in a second.
Anyway, so thank you so much, Peter, for your thoughtful points as well as philosophical points, scientific points. I think the audience will appreciate it, listening to you and also learning from one of the top neuroscientists in the world. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and wish you all the best during the coming holiday season, as well as wish you a safe trip to Europe in the near future. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.